First of all, I'd like to thank the Beijing Forum, and the notion of conflict and the harmony of civilization is something that today is probably more widely debated than ever before in recent history. In the opening ceremony, our Egyptian colleague showed a slide which I thought was quite effective, this world that is leading across the board. But I want to go back a bit before I get to the central theme of my topic. And I want to begin with some of the extremism that we see today and where lie the roots, and whether this is truly a clash of civilization or are these based upon the strategic interests of certain countries, many of these conflicts. In Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union entered the country, we now know that the United States, before the Soviets actually entered the country, they supported extremist groups, and they tried to encourage the Soviets into entering in order to create their Vietnam. As the advisor of the U.S. President Carter at the time admitted, before he passed away a couple of years ago. Along the Pakistani and Afghani border, the United States, along with the Saudis, promoted what later became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And Pakistan and Afghanistan, which were Muslim conservative countries, but had no real history of extremism in the contemporary era, now have become areas of concern because of the promotion of this extremism. Of course, Al-Qaeda later on came to create blowback for the United States in 9/11, and it was hoped that the United States would discontinue with this policy of supporting extremist groups. But unfortunately, in more recent years, we see that the United States has begun using this again. In the case of Syria and Libya, the United States and its allies used extremist groups. In Libya, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, which was a senior Al-Qaeda leader, became one of the leaders of the revolutionaries funded by U.S. allies, and he later went to a NATO country, the capital of a NATO country, Istanbul, to help fund the so-called Free Syrian Army. So the instability of Syria is linked to extremism, regardless of the shortcomings, the faults of the local government. We now know, though, that from the Qatari former Prime Minister's interview 3-4 days ago that I encourage especially the students here to watch. It's on Zero Hedge, there are other sites as well. He admitted that from the very beginning in Syria, from the very beginning, he went, at the time he was the Prime Minister, he went to Saudi Arabia in order to coordinate the killing, what he called the prey. This is on television. You can watch this. And of course, he complained because now the Saudis are blaming Qatar for the extremism that we see in this region. And the Qatari former Prime Minister was basically saying that we did all this in coordination with the Saudis and the Americans and the CIA. We know that John Kerry, in a leaked audio clip, all of this is online, in a leaked audio clip, speaking to opposition members close to the United States of Syria, the Syrian government, admitted that the United States allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus in order to put pressure on the president of Syria. We know that the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that was partially leaked through Judicial Watch, ironically a white right-wing organization in the United States. In it, it not only exposes the links between Libya and Syria, but it also exposes the fact that the United States knew from very early on in Syria that its allies were supporting extremists in Syria and Iraq, and they intended to establish a state, a Salafist state, between Syria and Iraq, the area which has been occupied by ISIS. And the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the largest military intelligence organization of the United States with 20,000 people working in it, the head of that agency at the time was General Flynn, who you all know about. He admitted in an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, that the United States took a willful decision to support its allies in this. So now we see the links between Afghanistan and Syria. What does it have to do with Central Asia? We'll get there. WikiLeaks documents have also exposed that Hillary Clinton knew that in 2014, Saudi Arabia and Qatar were funding ISIS. And we know quite openly, Obama in an interview with Thomas Friedman also said that when ISIS was taking over Iraq, the United States did not impede its progress to Baghdad because they wanted to put pressure on the Prime Minister of Iraq. And of course, the whole tens of thousands of tankers that were carrying out extensive trade between ISIS-held territory and Turkey and through Kurdish areas controlled by Barzani at the time, which the American Air Force never bombed, and it was only after the Russians began bombing ISIS positions that this extensive trade was stopped. So when we speak about a conflict of civilizations, I would argue that we did not have conflict, major conflict, extraordinary conflict in the Muslim world, within Muslim communities in the past. As I said, Pakistan and Afghanistan are a good example. But the extremism that has been exported to different areas because of the United States and its policies and its allies, that has been a major cause of concern. Ironically, U.S. allies such as Saudi Arabia have only harmed themselves. They failed in Syria, they failed in Iraq. Iraq today is much stronger than before. Syria is going back to normal. Now they've waged a war in Yemen, killing endless numbers of people. We don't know how many people have died of starvation and disease. They've occupied Bahrain. And now they've even created a siege on Qatar, their ally, their former ally. Qatar can only bring in food from Iran, from Iranian territory. The only way for Qatar to communicate with the outside world is through Iran now, because of the blockade that the Saudis and the Emirates have imposed on the country. Remember, the Saudis and the Emirates are the only two countries that ever recognized the Taliban in Afghanistan. So again, why is this important? The Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road initiative, of course, has two parts. But going to the first part, the Silk Road, it goes through an area where the United States has very limited access. And U.S. allies and the United States, what they did in Syria, for example, the Israelis, they also supported the Nusra Front. They continue to support them, the Al-Qaeda of Syria, and they tolerate ISIS on their border. This is all well documented. They bomb the Syrian government positions whenever Al-Qaeda is under pressure, and they treat their wounded. This is no secret. You can find all this online. But you won't find it in the mainstream media. But Central Asia is of serious concern for Iran, because the belief is that in future, if the United States feels that the links between Russia and China and Iran and Central Asia and Europe and China become a huge and major alternative route for trade and business in which the United States has no control over, that the same tools that they've used in the past can be used again. and the allies that were involved in extremism in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Libya, in Syria, Iraq, and across the board, who've carried out attacks in France, in Brussels, and in the countries that have supported the United States in the past, that there could be a repeat. When the Israelis, when the Saudis, when the Americans and others are willing to carry out and support such extremists for their own geopolitical interests, in Syria, in Afghanistan, there's no reason why they would not do it in Kazakhstan, or in Tajikistan, or in Uzbekistan, or in Kyrgyzstan, or inside the borders of Russia and China itself. So my belief is that the concern is not at all Islam or any other faith in this region. Just as we've seen in Myanmar, we've seen the United States as a Christian country with an honorable people, but a government that engages in wars and extremism, both under this administration and previous administrations, that the issue is not religious. There's conflicts, all sorts of conflicts for all sorts of excuses across the board and across the world. But the only way for a real harmony of civilizations is to prevent the usage of sectarianism and the promotion of sectarianism through extremism, whether it's nationalism, whether it's Wahhabism, whether it's any other form of ideology, to prevent them from being used by major powers to change the course and the livelihood of ordinary people in different regions. I would like to add one final point, and I'll make it short. And that is that, indeed, today, for Iran, the belief is that this extremism is not only backfiring and causing detriment to countries in Europe and the region, but also it's creating a concern for Iran in the sense that countries like Saudi Arabia are themselves becoming threatened by their own policies. For Iran, the collapse of Saudi Arabia is something that would deeply concern them, because ISIS was born in Saudi Arabia. The ideology of Wahhabism was born in Saudi Arabia. It was an obscure ideology. It has no major role in Islamic history. It was a small ideology in Najd, which only benefited from the huge amount of oil money that the Saudis have accumulated. And they've used that oil money to expand the ideology. So it has nothing to do with mainstream Islam. But because of the empowerment of this extremist ideology, the Crown Prince, who has created all sorts of crises in Qatar, as I said, in Yemen, in Bahrain, by occupying Bahrain, and he has created concern in Oman and even Kuwait. The only ally left is the United Arab Emirates. By doing this, he has created a financial crisis in the country. And alongside that, if he wishes to confront the royal family, or if he wishes to confront the Wahhabi school of thought that has grown so powerful over the last few decades, he could face serious difficulty. So this is a tool, that a monster that is, once it is created, dealing with it becomes very difficult and dangerous. So for Iran, as I said, the One Belt, One Road initiative is of key importance, especially because in the Persian Gulf, the United States has a permanent presence. It's always good to have an alternative route of trade. And northern Iran, Western China, Central Asia, Russia, and Europe can benefit enormously from this. And that is exactly why we are concerned, because of the enormous potential that this road has. Thank you very much.